Hello there developers, hope you're doing well. If you don't know me, I'm Mustafa Haidari and I heartwarmingly welcome you all to the channel. If you like the video, press that thumbs up button and consider subscribing to the channel because it helps a lot. In this video, we're going to cover the part 1 of Modern CSS, which includes the display grid and display flex. We're going to cover every corner of it, so let's begin learning. The display flex and the display grid, they are mainly two different topics inside the CSS. Let's first start off with the display flex, later we can continue over the display grid. So before we dive into the display flex, let's first understand that what is a display itself inside the CSS. A display inside CSS simply means that we can align the elements. For example, we can align the elements on top of each other, we can align the elements in front of each other, or we can align the elements wherever we want. Mainly, there are two displays inside the CSS. First is the display inline, second is the display block of an element. Mainly, there are some default elements which are already blocked and there are some default elements which are already inline. For example, the div element, paragraph element, h1 to h6, ol, ul, li, they are already the block elements inside the CSS. But the elements like span, anchor tag, strong, em, and many more elements are already inline elements inside the CSS. Block elements in the screen. Let me create the boilerplate of the HTML. Let's name it to the display and then go to the body of the element. So in here, I'll show you some elements which are already inline and some elements which are already blocked in display. Let's start off with the div element. I'm gonna write hello, and inside the second div, I'm gonna write world. So let's save and refresh it. As you can see that the hello and the world, they are appeared over the top of each other, which is the element block. The display of this element is already inside the block. But if I give you another example of a span element, I'm gonna write the same hello and the same world but inside the span. So if you see, the hello world is appeared in front of each other. So we can see that these elements are displayed in block and these elements are displayed in inline. And there are some other examples as well, like we can use the paragraph. I'm gonna write hello and inside the second paragraph I'm gonna write world. You see that the hello world is appeared on top of each other and the space between them is because of the margin and padding the elements are having by default. We can rather remove them from here. I'm gonna say that the style of everything, the margin of element should be 0 and the padding of element should be also 0. Now it's okay. So you see that the text that I have written inside the div element are appeared on top of each other, but the text that I have written inside the span element, they are appeared in front of each other, and also the text that I have written inside the paragraph tag, they are also appeared on top of each other. But let me show you another example, like I will say, let's try with anchor tag. I'm gonna give it a hashtag so that it should not redirect me to another link. I'm gonna write home and the second of it I'm gonna write contact. As you see that the home and contact are already defined in front of each other. Now this is the specification of the display inline element. What it does that it shows the element in front of each other, and the display block element, it shows the element on top of each other. Okay, I hope that this concept has been clear for you guys, that we are already having some default element which are designed into the inline and we are having some default elements which are designed into the block display. As I said that these elements are default inline or default blocked element, but we can also change them on our own will. For example, I can change the element from inline to block and I can change the element from block to inline. Let me show you another example. In this previous example, we are having two div elements and one span element. I'm gonna remove these two because we don't need, we can only work on one of them. So this is the div element which is already blocked and this is the span element which is already inline. If I save and refresh in the browser, so you can see that the hello world, the first hello world is appeared on top of each other and the second hello world is appeared in front of each other. I can change this. How? I will go to the styling and I'll say the div. We can name it by using class, or we can directly name it by div. I'm now using the div because we don't have any other div inside our element, but if you want to be more specific, you can use the class by using dot. So we are now inside the styling of the div element. What I need to do over here is to change the display of an element. By default, this div element was displayed into block, but I'm going to change this element to display of inline. So we see that the display element of div is inlined over here. If I save and refresh it, you can see that the hello world, the first hello world is also appeared in front of each other, and the second hello world is also appeared in front of each other. The first hello world belongs to the div, and the second hello world belongs to the span in our element. As I changed the display of div from block to inline, I can also change the display of the span from inline to block. I'm gonna say that the display of it should be block. Let's save and refresh it. As you can see that the first element, which is defaulted into block, is changed to inline, and the second element, which is defaulted to inline, is changed to block. This element was before inline, now it's block. This element was before blocked, now it is inlined in our code. Now I hope that the display has been clear for you guys, that what it does inside the CSS. So we can now move on to the display flex. So before we were having some default element by the display of inline and some default element by the display of block, but when we change the element from inline to block or from block to inline, it was changed the display of that exact element. But by using display flex, we can change the display of their children. Let me show you an example. So before we had, for example, two divs over here, the first div and the second div. By default, they were always appearing on top of each other because they were displayed to block, but we could change them from display block to display inline like this. It was working exactly okay. What I mean by display flex, if we take an example of two parents, for example, this is the first parent and this is the second parent. Inside each parent, we are having some elements which are already displayed to block. For example, this element and for example, these elements. I meant that when we change the display of an element to flex, what it does that it does not bring the same element in front or on the top of each other, but what it does that it changes the position of their children in front of each other. For example, if I change the display of this element to flex, what it will do that it will change the children's inside it in front of each other. I mean that the exact parent will not move from their place, but they will change the position of their children. Let me show you an example of the display flex, that what it does. For example, I'm gonna make a parent for it and I'm gonna name it to the class of parent. Let's just clear this for now. I'm gonna clear it, and inside this I'm gonna make some paragraph. So I'm gonna make 3 paragraphs by the class of child. So we are having 3 paragraphs by the class of child, and each one of them are inside the parent element. So basically this is the parent and these 3 are the childs of that parent. So let's come to the styling. I'm gonna say that the parent element should have, first of all, it should have a width of, for example, 400 pixels, and it should have a height. It should have a height of the 600 pixel, and also it should have background color of light blue. So we said that the parent should have a width of 400 pixel and a height of 600 pixel. The background color should be the light blue. So if I save and refresh it over here, as you can see, there is the div appeared in our screen, but there is this also having 3 child of paragraph. So I'm gonna say that each child should have a height of the 40 pixel and the width of the 40 pixel. The background color should be red. Let's save and refresh it. As you can see that this is not aligned. This is the 3 boxes that have appeared on top of each other because the display of this paragraph was defaulted to block. That's why they are appearing over top of each other. But I can change the display of these elements from block to inline. They will appear in front of each other. So let's now just focus over the display flex. What it does is that we can change the display of their children by changing the display of their parents. What I mean by this is that if I come over here and change the display of it to the flex, when I save and refresh, the element will appear in front of each other. What I meant back over there was that when we change the display of an element to the flex, it does not apply its changes over itself. Now I'm sure that there might be a question inside your mind that if we can use the display inline, why do we need the display flex in our element? We can change the display of these elements, like we can say the display of these elements should be inline over here. Why do we need to use the display flex while we can use the traditional way to do and see the exact result in our CSS? Now there are some other features that is also coming with the display flex. I'm gonna show it to you. The first feature is the gap property, that we can use it to give spaces between the children. I need to give some spaces between each children. The first box, the second box, and the third box. I want spaces between each of them. So I'm gonna go to the parent and say that each element should have a gap of exact 10 pixels. When I save and refresh, as you can see that these children are having the 10 pixel spaces between each other because I have used the gap over here. If I change this to 100 pixel, as you can see that each children is now having 100 pixel of gap between each other. This is the first feature of the display flex, that we can use gap inside our elements. The second feature of the display flex is the alignment of the children. We can align the children on the top, we can align them on the bottom, we can align them even in the center of the element. For example, we had the parent over here, and inside this parent we had 3 children, the first, the second, and the third children. So each children was appeared in front of each other, but we can change the alignment of it over the x-axis and over the y-axis. Like I can move it to this corner, or I can move it to this corner, even I can move it to the center of the element. For the x-axis, we need to adjust the align items property, which is set it to left by default. But for the y-axis, we need to adjust the justify content property, which is set to top by the default. Now, when align items of the element is set to the left by default and the justify content of element is set to top by default, we will always see the element or the children's over this corner of the screen. So as I said that we can use the align items and the justify content so that we could move the children to the top, to center, or to the corner. So as I said that by default the justify content is the top and the align items is the left of the element. I'm gonna reset the gap of it to the 10 pixel. As you can see that it's aligned to the top and it's also aligned to the left. But if I come here and use the justify content property, we can align it to the center over the x-axis. When I save and refresh this, as you can see that this element is moved to the center over the x-axis, and I can even change it to the end. I will say that justify content of the element should be end. It will appear at the end of element. And the same that we can use the align items. We can change the align items of the element to the center, to the start, or to the end. When I say it to the center, the element will appear in the center by default, and when I change it to the end, the element will appear in the end. For example, I want my element to appear over this corner of the screen. So first I need to specify the x and the y axis. So over the x-axis, we change the justify content, which I set to this corner. So the justify content will be on the left, which we can use for its start. And as I said that the align items, which is appeared over the y-axis, this is the align items. So we can change the align items to the end. When I save and refresh it, as you can see that these elements are moved to this corner of the screen. Just to recap, and let me make it clear for you guys that the align items will move over the y-axis and the justify content will move over the x-axis. So if we want to change the y-axis alignment of the element, we will use the align items, and if we want to change the x-axis alignment of the element, we will use the justify content. And there's another fact that we can use the space value inside the justify content. For example, if I want to divide each children's equally inside each other, I will use the space property inside the justify content. But before that, we need to change the width of this element to be more specific. As I said that we can use the space property inside the justify content. When I write here space, I'm given 3 options. When I use the space between, each children is divided into 3 parts. What the space between does that it divides each children equally between each other. Like the space between, we can use the space evenly. When I use the space evenly, as you can see that each children is having equal space between each other, but the only difference between space evenly and space between was that the space evenly also takes some space over the right and over the left of the element. As you can see that these space between the first and the second element and the space between the third and the second element, they are the same as the space on the right and over the left. Now what does the space around the if I use the space around properties, so you can see that half of it will be divided on the each side. Now I'm sure that everything that I have explained for you guys has been clear. While keeping everything in mind, just make sure that there also comes a flex direction. Like when we change the display of an element to the flex, by default it appeared each children in front of each other. But we can use the flex direction and change the position of them, like we can see them over top of each other. So for example, when I come here and I will remove the justify content and the align items, I use the display flex and the gap, but I'm gonna come here and use the flex direction. I'm gonna say the flex direction. So the flex direction of element is by default row, which is the same as we saw earlier on the screen. But if I change this to the column, each element will appear on the top of each other. Just keep one thing in mind, that when we use the flex direction column, the justify content will be replaced with the align items, and the align items will be replaced with the justify content. Like before that, if you wanted to change the x-axis, we would probably use the justify content, and if you wanted to change the y-axis, we would use the align item. But now that we have changed the flex direction of it from row to column, we must use the justify content for the y-axis, and we will use the align items for the x-axis in our code. Now that you have gotten familiar with the display flex, let's move on to the display grid. The display flex and the display grid, they are almost the same, but the only two difference that it has is that in display grid we can divide the columns and we can move a specific column to specific position. For instance, as you can see on your screen, that in this example, they are divided their rows and their columns according to their own will. 1, 2, 3. They are going to have 3 rows and 4 columns on each side. The first element is going to contain a full height, while the second element is going to contain 2 by 4 width. As you can see that if we divided these columns like this, the first column, the second column, the third column, and the fourth column. And if we divide the row, this is the first row, and this is the second, and the last one is the third row. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 elements in total. The first element, it has said that it should contain the full height of the parent, like this. It will contain the full height of their parent. The second element should contain 2 by 4 width of their parent. The third element should be working as normal, and we can say that this is the fourth, this is the fifth, this is the sixth, seventh, and 8th element. And in the last element, we can say that it should contain 2 of 3 rows inside a div. So basically, this is how display grid work. We can define as many columns as we want, as many rows as we want, and we can specify that each column should be placed where. We can place it in a specific corner, we can place it in a bottom, we can place it on the right, wherever we want. For example, I'm gonna say that I'm gonna have a parent. Let's name it to parent. I'm gonna say that it should have 3 children. So I'm gonna make a div, and then we can name it to the child. And we can say that I want to have 3 of this. Enter. So we have 3 div elements with the class of child over here. So first we need to specify its parent. So I'm going to say that dot parent should contain a height of 100 VH. It should contain the whole screen, we can say. And the width of it should be 100%. And I'm going to give it a background color of the aquarium. Let's save and refresh it. As we can see that this is the parent that we see on the screen. So inside this parent, we had 3 children. The first, second, and the third children. So if I come over here, it can select every children inside this parent, and I'm gonna say that each children should have a background color of, for example, we can say crimson. Let's save and refresh it. As you can see, we cannot see anything in the script. Why? Because it's that the child elements, they are having a width of 100% by default, but they are not having any height inside that element by default. So we can define their height, like I can say that each element should have a height of 140 pixels, and we can say that each element should have a width of, for example, 200. Let's save and refresh it. As you can see that these are the children that we see. So now what I need to do over here is that to change the display of their parents to display of grid. Now, as I said that the display grid is having rows and columns inside it. So when I save and refresh it, as you can see that it has divided each children according to the row. So what I need over here is to define the column of their children. So I will say grid template columns. Now this grid template columns is saying that how many columns should each row have. The grid template columns is simply defining our columns inside each row. If you want a single column in each row, we can define it over here. If you want 4 columns in each row, we can define it over here. For now, I'm gonna say I want to have a 1 column inside each row, so we will say 1 FR. Let's save and refresh it. You definitely cannot see any difference over here. But what if I say that each row is containing a single column? Like this is the first row, this is the second row, and this is the third row. But again, you will say that this is not an entire row. So let me make it clear for you guys. Over the children, we defined a width to it. We said that each child should have a width of 200 pixels. When I remove the child, let's save and refresh it. As you can see that now each row is containing a single column. Each row is containing a single column for it. And if I want to have 2 columns inside a single row, I will say another 1 FR. So what it means over here that we are using 2 FRs over here. So it means that each row should have 2 columns inside it. Let's save. As you can see that this is the first column, this is the second column, this is the third and the fourth element, because we are not having any fourth element. That's why it's not being shown. We can use the gap between them. Like I want to say that each element should have a 10 pixels of gap. Now it's very clear for you guys that the first column, the second column and the third column is shown over the screen. And if I remove the height of it also, let's save and refresh. As you can see that now it's very clear for you guys. We divided each row into 2 columns. We said that each row should contain 2 columns. So this is the first element, this is the second element. Now this row doesn't has any extra space, so the third children has moved automatically to the bottom. And if I add another children to it, like I will have now 4 children inside a single parent. Let's save and refresh it. As you can see that first, second, third and fourth, they are already placed in their places. Okay, what if I add another children? As you can see that first element, second element, third element, fourth and the fifth element, they are adjusting themselves to complete these columns that we have defined. Okay, so for example, I'm gonna say that another column should be also added inside a single row. So now we are having 3 columns inside each row. As you can see that the first, second and the third, they are placed in the first row, and the fifth and the fourth element, they are placed in the second row. So now we can see that this taking a lot of time and effort to do. Like I can say that 1 FR, 1 FR and 1 FR is consuming a lot of time and effort to do it. What I can do over here is to use repeat. The repeat function is requiring 2 parameters. The first parameter that we are going to pass it is the number that you want to repeat it. For example, I want to say 4. It means that it should be repeated 4 times. And the second parameter that we want to define is our 1 FR. So it means that it should repeat this 1 FR inside this grid template column score 4 times. When I save and refresh it, it's repeating it for 4 times. Each row is containing now 4 columns. The 5th column that has no space over the first row, it is automatically moved to the second row. If I say that each row should contain 1 column, it's like this. And if I say that each row should contain 2 columns, it's like this. So very straightforward, you can use it as you want. Now that it has been clear for you guys that we can divide each columns in the row, like we can say that each row should contain 3 columns, each row should contain 5 columns, we can repeat it as we want. Now let's move on to the second step, which is the grid column. So for instance, I want the first children to contain an entire row. For example, the first children width should be 100%, and the second should be here, the third should be here, the fourth and the fifth should be in this empty space. So what I need over here is to define the columns of each element. So I'm gonna say that, for example, I will create another class for it. I'm gonna name it to call-span. So let's name it to call span of 2. So inside this call span of 2, I want the first children to take effect over this. So I will name the class of it to call span of 2. So inside this, what we need to write is the grid column. When we use the grid column, we can specify that how many rows in a column it should take. For instance, I want the first element to contain an entire row. So what I need to write over here is the span of 2. When we write the span of 2, what it means that we have used the 2 over here. So we said that each row should contain a 2 column in each. So what I mean by span 2 is that it should take an entire row, because we divided the parent, or we can say the row, to 2 columns each. When we use the span 2, it will contain 2 columns instead of 1. Let's see that. As you can see, the first element is now containing the entire row, while the second element, they are containing one column each. So if I say like I want to have 3 columns in each row, so we see that the first element is now containing 2, because we did define the span 2 over here. The span 2 means that it should contain 2 columns in a row. The second column has been automatically placed here. The third column, the fourth and the fifth column, they are already adjusted by themselves. So I can say that each row should have a 4 columns. So this is the first element that we say that it should have a span of 2. So for example, I want to say that it should contain a 3 column inside each row. So I will say span of 3. When I use the span of 3, the first element will contain 3 columns in a row. The first, second and the third column is already contained by the first element. The second, third, fourth and fifth are already adjusted by themselves. I hope that the grid column has been clear so far. While keeping that in mind, we also have a grid row inside the display grid. Let me just explain it with an example for you. So for instance, I want this first element to contain 2 columns. This is the first column, this is the second column. I want it to contain these 2 columns, and I want it also to contain an entire row, like the first row and the second row. So we will see something like this. It will contain this column, this column, this column and this column. And the second element will move over here. The third element and the fourth element, the fifth element will move over the next slide. So what I need over here is that I want this element to contain 2 rows out of 4. So I will change this to 2. Let's see that this element is already contained 2 columns in a row. So I also need this element to contain 2 rows. I want to say that this row should be also for this first element, and the second row should be also for this first element. So it will appear an entire box in the screen. So what I need over here, first of all, we will go to the inspect element, and when I go to the inspect element, we are having this option of grid. By default, it's not enabled, so some of you guys might not see it, but we do have a display of grid inside this. So when I on this, as you can see that there are a bunch of numbers over here. The first, second, third, fourth and the fifth. These numbers are for the columns and these numbers are for the rows. I need the first element to start from this number and end to this number. So when I want to change the rows of this column, I will need the grid rows. I will say the grid dash rows. Inside this grid rows, we have a grid row start and the grid row end. First of all, I will start with the grid rows start. So I'll say that it should start from this number and end to this number. I'll say that the grid row should start from 1 and the grid row should end with the number 3. As you can see, the first element, it has contained an entire box in this element, and the second element, the third, the fourth and the fifth element. What else do I do over here is I want to change the whole span of this element also. I want the first, second, third. I want the fourth element to contain 2 columns in row. So I will go to this and let's name it to call dash span 2. So I will come over here and name this to call dash span 2. I'll say that the grid column should contain 2 columns in a row, and I will remove, let me adjust this. Let me remove this children. So as you can see that the first element is containing 2 columns and 2 rows. The second element is containing 1 column in 1 row. The third element is containing also 1 column in 1 row. But the fourth element is containing 1 row and 2 columns. I hope that the display flex and grid has been cleared with all their properties. If you have any questions, feel free to say it in the comment section. See you in the next video. Until then, have a great time coding.